March 1945. A captured bridge over the Rhine, Germany. Muddy water swirls below the steel girders. Tank engines rumble on the west bank, waiting for the signal to advance. On a steel beam 20 feet above the Grey River, a lone soldier sits with his boots dangling over the edge. He holds a small, dented harmonica to his lips. He plays a slow, haunting melody that drifts through the cold morning air. Combat engineers tightening bolts stop their wrenches. Tired infantrymen leaning against muddy trucks turn their heads to listen. The urgent rush of an entire armored army slows down for a brief, unexpected moment. But an operations officer marches down the center lane with a clipboard, shouting for the music to stop immediately. A 3-star general stands just 20 feet behind him, watching. This is the story of what General George Patton did when he discovered a young soldier playing a slow melody on a harmonica right in the middle of a vital military crossing. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the war he fought and the man he hid. Private First Class Henry Crow Dog was 20 years old. He came from the windy plains of the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. He belonged to the Lakota people. He belonged to a lineage of warriors who understood that the sky and the rivers carried memory. He enlisted in the army because he wanted to prove that his people still knew how to fight for a homeland. He had seen the muddy roads of France. He had seen the frozen woods of the Ardennes. He had lost his cousin at the hands of an artillery shell near Bastogne. He carried very little in his canvas pack. He carried extra wool socks, a pocket knife, and a small nickel-plated harmonica. He had bought it at a trading post before basic training. He played it at twilight when the shooting stopped. The metal was scratched and cold against his lips, but the sound kept him grounded. It connected him to the prairie. It kept him human in a world made of flying iron. Now he sat on a cold steel girder over the Rhine, watching the dark water roll beneath his muddy boots, playing for the dead. Major Robert Vance was 41 years old. He came from a wealthy family in Boston, Massachusetts. He was an operations officer attached to the 3rd Army staff. He wore a tailored wool overcoat that had no grease stains on the cuffs. His boots were polished to a dark shine. Despite the thick river mud, he believed in schedules, grease pencils, and absolute mechanical efficiency. He believed that the army was a factory, and that soldiers were simply parts to be used until they broke. He often told his subordinates that sentimentality was a disease that slowed down the machinery of victory. He carried a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, a textile magnate. He checked it every 3 minutes. He viewed the war as a problem of logistics and traffic management. He despised delays. He looked at the vast assembly of trucks and tanks waiting by the riverbank and saw only a clock ticking towards zero. By March 1945, the Allied armies were racing across Western Europe. The German military machine was crumbling into chaos, but the Rhine River remained the final geographic barrier, protecting the heart of the Third Reich. It was a massive, deep moat of gray water that the German High Command desperately wanted to defend. They had blown up dozens of bridges to slow down the American advance. When the Third Army managed to seize a major bridge intact, it was considered an absolute tactical miracle. Every minute saved meant more tanks on the eastern bank before the enemy could reorganize their defenses. The entire supply line depended on that single span of steel and concrete. The pressure on the Allied command structure was immense during this phase of the campaign. Broken infrastructure, collapsing local governments, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war created a logistical nightmare along the front lines. In many sectors, senior officers routinely overlooked minor infractions, small delays, and breaches of military protocol if the columns kept moving forward. They tolerated messy uniforms, informal language, and small moments of civilian interaction because the sheer speed of the advance was all that mattered to the Supreme Command. But the tension between raw mechanical speed and basic human endurance remained a constant friction point in every unit, On this particular morning, the push to cross was reaching a fever pitch as heavy trucks idled in lines that stretched back for miles into the dense woods. The air was filled with the bitter smell of exhaust and wet mud. The engineers worked frantically, their boots slipping on the slick metal as they reinforced the damaged supports. Everything was set to move at maximum capacity within minutes. Yet the entire momentum of the force suddenly converged on a single point over the water. Major Vance walked onto the bridge. His leather boots clicked against the steel plates. He stopped directly beneath the girder where the private was sitting. He tapped his clipboard with his silver pen. He shouted up at the soldier, "Get down from there immediately, soldier." Private Crow Dog did not stop playing right away. He finished the phrase of the melody. The music lingered over the river. He placed the harmonica in his shirt pocket. He looked down at the officer. "Sir, I am just waiting for the crossing to begin." "I do not care what you are waiting for," Vance said. "You are blocking the visual line for the engineers. You are distracting the men from their duties. This bridge is a military asset, not a concert hall." Crow Dog lowered himself from the beam. He dropped onto the wooden planks of the walkway. He stood at attention, but his posture was relaxed. His uniform was covered in dirt from the trenches. "The men are tired, sir," Crow Dog said. "They just wanted to hear something from home." Vance stepped closer. He looked at the private's dirty face. He looked at the small patch on his shoulder. "Your opinions on the morale of this unit are entirely irrelevant," Vance said. "You are a private. Your job is to move when you are told to move. This army runs on regulations and schedules, not folk songs. Look at the mud on your trousers. Look at the state of your equipment. You are a disgrace to the uniform." "I have been fighting in this uniform for 6 months, sir," Crow Dog said. "Do not talk back to me," Vance said. "People like you do not understand what it takes to organize a real war. You think you can wander around and play music whenever you feel lonely. This crossing is timed down to the exact second. Every truck that delays costs lives on the other side. Your little performance is a direct violation of discipline." "The music did not stop the work, sir," Crow Dog said. "The engineers were still bolting the plates." Vance raised his voice. He pointed his finger at the private's chest. "I told you to be quiet," Vance said. "You do not explain things to an officer. You are a completely undisciplined soldier from a reservation. You do not belong in a modern mechanized army. If you cannot follow simple orders, I will have you court-martialed for insubordination before this day is over." An infantry captain walked over to the major. He looked at the private and then at the clipboard. "Is there a problem here, Major?" the captain asked. "This man is refusing to follow direct commands," Vance said. "He is creating a disturbance on the main supply route. Contact the military police and have him removed from the column. I want him placed under arrest immediately." The captain looked at the young soldier and sighed. He turned toward the communications tent near the bank. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly onto the wooden planking of the bridge approach, its tires splashing muddy river water onto the boots of the nearby infantrymen. The 3-star general sat in the front seat, his posture perfectly rigid. The 4 silver stars on his helmet gleamed against the gray overcast sky, and the famous twin ivory-handled revolvers rested in their holsters at his hips. The entire area grew dead silent as he stepped out of the vehicle. The engineers dropped their tools, and the truck drivers cut their engines. He walked toward the group with a slow, deliberate stride, his eyes scanning the structure. He looked at the major, then at the young private standing by the rail, and finally down at the dark water of the Rhine below. Patton studied the operations officer. "Major, what is the nature of the delay on this crossing?" Patton asked. "Sir, this private was blocking the walkway and creating a major logistical disturbance," Vance said. "What was the private doing to disturb my army?" Patton asked. "He was sitting on a girder playing a harmonica instead of preparing his gear," Vance said. "Did he refuse to clear the path when the column started moving?" Patton asked. No, sir. But his lack of discipline was a poor example for the engineers, Vance said. Patton looked at Major Vance for a long moment. His voice was very quiet, but it carried clearly over the water. You see a factory here, Major, Patton said. You see numbers on a chart and trucks on a road. You think this war is won entirely by the turning of gears and the ticking of a silver pocket watch. But you are completely wrong. An army is not made of iron and gasoline alone. It is made of men. This young private has been living in the mud and the blood for 6 months, while you sat in a clean office with a grease pencil. He has seen his friends torn apart by artillery fire on the way to this river. He has carried the weight of this campaign on his back. When a soldier finds a way to keep his heart alive between the battles, you do not crush it under your boot. You do not lock a man in a guardhouse because he remembers how to sing. The people on the other side of this river have forgotten what humanity sounds like, and our men need to remember it before they cross. You have a choice, Major. You can stand here and find a harmonica of your own to play, or you can step aside and let this young man finish his piece. Decide right now. Vance stood frozen, his face completely pale as he looked into the general's eyes, unable to utter another word. Patton turned to the infantry captain and ordered him to cancel the arrest demand immediately. He then looked up at Private Crow Dog and told him to climb back onto the steel beam. The young soldier moved quickly, his boots gripping the wet metal, as he ascended to his previous position high above the gray river. The entire assembly of men watched in total silence as the private pulled the nickel-plated harmonica from his shirt pocket and placed it back to his lips. Patton walked back to his staff officers and commanded everyone to stand down for the next 2 minutes. The heavy trucks idled quietly on the approach roads, their exhaust mixing with the cold mist rising from the water. Major Vance stood near the railing, his face completely flushed as he was forced to stand at rigid attention right beneath the private's boots, holding his silver pen tightly in his hand. The slow, haunting notes of the folk song began to drift across the expanse of the Rhine once more. Every engineer stopped his work, and every infantryman leaned against his equipment to listen. For those 2 minutes, the entire machinery of the Third Army came to an absolute halt on the western bank, suspended by the simple sound of a single metal instrument. Henry Crow Dog went home to South Dakota after the war ended. He returned to the Pine Ridge Reservation and built a small wooden house near the creek, where he had played as a boy. He became a rancher, tending to a small herd of cattle and teaching his grandchildren how to listen to the wind across the prairie grass. He never spoke about the war to his neighbors, and he never bragged about the day. He stopped an entire armored army with a few musical notes. He kept the dented nickel-plated harmonica in a small velvet bag inside his dresser drawer for the rest of his life. He lived a long and peaceful life on the reservation, surrounded by his family, before he passed away quietly in the winter of 1982. Robert Vance faced a very different reality when he returned to Boston after his discharge from the military. His family wealth could not shield him from the bitter memories of the campaign, and he found it difficult to adapt to the slow pace of civilian corporate life. He spent years working as an executive for a manufacturing firm, but his subordinates noted that he had become an isolated, quiet man who rarely smiled. He refused to attend any military reunions or veteran events throughout the 1950s and 60s. He lived alone in a large house filled with old clocks and calendars until his death in 1974. General Patton never mentioned the incident on the Rhine in any of his official post-war press conferences or public speeches. He left no formal record of the dispute in the daily operational logs of the Third Army headquarters. However, a private diary entry written by his close personal aide on the evening of the crossing revealed a small glimpse into the commander's hidden thoughts. The aide noted that Patton sat in his command car long after the tanks had crossed into enemy territory, staring at the dark water while holding a small piece of paper. The general remarked to his assistant that a man who cannot appreciate the song of a soldier has no business leading them into the jaws of hell. Some historians have argued that Patton's decision to halt a critical river crossing for a piece of music was an irresponsible breach of tactical judgment. They point out that a bridgehead over the Rhine was the most heavily contested prize in Western Europe, where every single second of delay could have allowed the retreating enemy to fortify their positions or launch a devastating artillery counterattack. Other military analysts have argued the exact opposite, defending the general's actions as a masterclass in psychological leadership. They maintain that Patton understood his men were reaching the absolute limits of human endurance, and that a brief moment of shared emotional connection was worth more to the unit's fighting spirit than 2 extra minutes of mechanized movement on a clock. What is certain is that the Third Army crossed the river with unstoppable momentum, carrying the memory of that simple melody straight into the heart of Germany. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have ordered the soldier to move aside immediately, to keep the column advancing without delay? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories about the war he fought and the man he hid, make sure to subscribe.